All right, so I'm going to share with y'all tonight a reflection on Acts and these days of liberations from the perspective of the organized poor. So in the Christian lectionary, we are in the days after Easter, what they call Eastertide, which is about 50 days or 50 days that lead up to this big moment called Pentecost and this great coming together of people in the Spirit. At Freedom Church, this time of year we call the days of liberation. And Jesus has, been brutally executed by the state. The movement is scattered and scared. The empire seems invincible. But the story of this season is that out of this death, out of this violence, that life endures and grows in the fertile ground of truth that was revealed in Jesus' life and the prophetic movement that he revived in the people's unkillable longing to be free. The lectionary this week looks at Acts 9, which tells this pretty well-known story of a dramatic conversion of Saul to Paul. And we'll get to that, but I wanted to start, and I think it's helpful to take some time to look back through the book of Acts and up to the point where we meet Paul, because it gives us some valuable insight for thinking about our moment and for our movement. So the book of Acts is the continuation of Luke's gospel. Sometimes they call it Luke Acts as one set of texts. It is in part an account of the growth and establishment of the early church, of the community of believers that followed the way. At this point, they're not understood as Christians, or it is not understood as the church yet. So throughout this, I'm going to refer to the followers of the way, which was what this early movement described itself as. Um, and this way is the way that was revealed through Jesus's life and ministry, death, and resurrection. So the writer of Acts describes the disciples spreading out across the region, healing people, training new leaders, continuing to live in resistance to the empire's way of domination. Sorry, I just lost it. I'm sorry, I just lost my space here. I was trying to see you all. Okay. Um, the core message of these disciples, these early disciples and apostles, these movement organizers, is the good news that when Jesus died, the way that was revealed in the life of Jesus did not die. The human-made forces of death and violence and domination that killed Jesus and scattered the movement did not have the final word. The disciples attest to this belief and share its truth in their words, but they prove it in their deeds and in the response of the people. In Acts 2, we read about thousands being brought into the movement. Quote, those who welcomed Peter's message were baptized, and that day about 3,000 persons were added. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. This last part, I think, is very notable. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and prayers. This is a summary of the core beliefs guiding the disciples, the apostles, this movement of the way. It is the essence of the way that Jesus taught. It is what was compelling people to join the movement. Teaching and fellowship, breaking bread, and prayers. These are the foundations upon which the movement is built. First is meeting needs, breaking bread, and second is prayer or teaching. So continually reflecting spiritually, politically on how these needs are met, or if they're not, what might be denying us those needs and what needs to be done to change that. This is what we might call projects of survival. The disciples were organizing the people on these principles and on this basis. It was, in other words, a survival revival. So the growth and energy of the movement is also putting the disciples at risk. They're definitely being noticed. The authorities see the impact of the movement, and it wasn't something that was small and private anymore. It was pulling in folks from small villages and overflowing into the streets. If you look at Acts 5, it says that yet more than ever believers were added to the Lord. Great numbers of both men and women so that they even carried out the sick into the streets and laid them on cots and mats in order that Peter's shadow might fall on some of them as he came by. There were so many seeking the blessings of Peter that he just would walk by, I guess, and his shadow would do the work. The passage goes on. A great number of people would also gather from the towns around Jerusalem, bringing the sick and those tormented by unclean spirits, and they were all cured. Again, Acts 4, the authorities arrest Peter and John for the healing and drawing too much attention. Notable, it is the Sadducees that are leading the way here. One of the kind of uh, uh, Jewish movements of the time that were in conflict with the followers of the way. Then in Acts 12, we read of Peter being arrested again and miraculously breaking out of prison with the help of an angel. Um, Also, the movement is getting more organized and more strategic. In Acts 6, it says that there are, quotes, the seven, which includes Stephen and Philip, who are selected to focus on food distribution. These are sometimes described as the early deacons of the church. And their role is to care for the distribution of food, and in order to free up other disciples to teach and develop new leaders. So they're getting strategic, organized, they're building out structures, things are growing, right? And the commitment of the followers is also getting deeper and stronger and being tested with absolutely brutal violence. In Acts 8, Stephen, who is often referred to as the first Christian martyr, is publicly stoned to death for boldly confessing his belief in and commitment to the way. And who was there, right, as giving approval for Stephen's stoning and publicly? It was Saul. Saul was witnessing and giving his um, okay for this act. And so this brings us to Acts 9, which is where we pick up the story of Paul's conversion. And there are also many lessons here for us in our movement. And first of all, who is Paul, right? He is definitely part of the force that's bearing down and legitimizing the persecution of the early movement. We know that he's educated and holds a position of religious authority and influence, and also that he's a Roman citizen. And why does he have it out for these early followers? So part of the answer might be his identity as a Pharisee and also the son of a Pharisee. The Pharisees, just to say a bit, is a Greek word that means set apart. And they too were sort of a renewal or reform movement in some ways similar to what the movement of Jesus was. But they emerged earlier after the Maccabee revolt around the second century and were concentrated in Jerusalem. So the Pharisees was also a reform movement in that they believed not just in a written Torah, but also an oral tradition. So this, opened them to connecting more with uneducated masses of people. They also believed that everyone was a practitioner, not just priests, and that everyone had this responsibility to live out the law of the Torah in their daily lives. And finally, they understood and interpreted the law, the Torah, not only through what was written, but also through the movement of the Spirit and considered the ever-changing context around us. So, this was somewhat of a reform movement is the point, I guess. And in Jesus's time, the Pharisees did also play a very influential role in ancient Israel's social and political life up through the destruction of the temple. Their more anti-elitist and democratic principles contrasted them to the Sadducees, which we mentioned earlier, who were, behind some of the more dramatic persecution. And the Sadducees were more conservative and more loyal to the elite. But I think we should understand both the Pharisees and the Sadducees as firmly connected to and in strong relationship with the powerful. So it could be that part of Paul's hostility towards the followers of Jesus and those of the way was his own loyalty and devotion to this way of the Pharisees, which again is itself fairly radical and reformist. But these dynamics of ideological religious struggle and their influence on the economic and political life of the people help us think through our own moment, I think. Who represents the empire? Who are the Pharisees? Who is the movement of the way in our times? One group that we're presented with on a daily basis is this group of that identify with MAGA or may not say it, but have these tendencies towards Christian nationalism and white supremacy. They also claim to be of the people. They too are allegedly trying to restore a purity of faith that has been degraded, they say, by secularism or communism or anti-family values or wokeism or non-Christian Christians. And they also describe the movement that they are part of as anti-elite and anti-institution and as putting power back in the hands of people. In reading Acts, they would almost certainly want to see themselves as the persecuted followers of the way, whose movement has grown powerful enough to take back power and start building the world God intended. There's a lot to sort out here, and I'm sure, a lot of opinions on this. But the part I would focus on is how power in this movement is not being used to expand or centralize the love of God, but to restrict it, to exclude and condemn certain people from it, and to use violence and war to establish prosperity instead of care for people, health care or housing, and to use that power to concentrate the power and wealth of a few. So maybe the few that they're concentrating that wealth into are slightly different hands, but it is in a slightly different form. But it is hard to see that MAGA and Christian nationalism is anything else but the restoration and strengthening of empire and its tendencies. But Paul and the Pharisees also remind us, I think, of another expression of belief in our midst, the progressive and religiously liberal position. These also check a lot of the same boxes as the Pharisees. They're critical of the elite, and many have anti-capitalist critiques and point out the systemic failures of our system. Similar to the Pharisees, they are okay with a more democratic leadership and authority in the church. Religious liberals are happy to read and interpret the Bible in the context of our world. But also similar to Paul and to the Pharisees, they still feel threatened, I would argue. And certainly they feel threatened by the unchristian, quote, behavior of the MAGA and the white supremacists, the nationalists, nationalism that underpins a lot of that movement. But they also, and maybe this is less obvious, are threatened by those who identify some as Christians or some that are part of mainline traditions or some that are just leaders of the poor or some that are both. These are those who see clearly that the institutions of the church, mainline, whether it's mainline or nationalists or MAGA, that are deeply broken and all are in different ways still doing the bidding of the powerful, the empire, having internalized this logic of these systems that dominate us. These prophets and leaders and communities, many of whom are just trying to survive, are those who stand outside of the church or on the inside, but on the margins, as Richard Rohr likes to say. And maybe not explicitly, but through their actions and ways of organizing are calling for a much more radical rejection of the way things are and a fundamental renewal of spiritual life. To me, this represents more closely what the Jesus movement was in Paul's time, not because it is more radical, but because that its radicality comes from being truly committed to building from the bottom up, that it has been forged in the experience of degradation, violence, and oppression, but also sings a new song, not a tired old hymn, but a song full of the anguish of suffering, the joy of what we feel and see and hear when we stop lying and start loving. It is a movement that starts and stays grounded in the survival needs of the community and is guided by a vision of religion and of God that is alive, that takes an active role in resisting and unsettling power and lifting up the lowly, and does not restrict God to the space of a temple or a creed or to those or to these or those people, but asserts a boundless freedom of God's will to liberate and help all life thrive. So Pharisees, Sadducees, MAGA, Christian nationalism, progressive Christians, empire, movements of the poor, a lot to consider as we reflect on our movement and our moment and who we want to be. But I want to just return here as a way of conclusion to Saul, the Pharisee. And when we meet Saul in Acts, he is right in the middle of the persecution of the followers of the way in Jerusalem. The things seem to be getting more desperate. Emboldened by the growth of the movement, Stephen, one of the deacons in charge of food distribution in Jerusalem, is publicly stoned, as we remember, for his declaration that the followers of the way are the true inheritors of the tradition of Moses and the prophets. Saul is right there witnessing and approving of the execution. Um, and he also takes an active role in a wave of violence against the followers of the way. So in Acts 8, we hear, as for Saul, he made havoc of the church, entering into every house and hauling away men and women and committing them to prison. Then in Acts 9, Saul, his fear growing, maybe hearing word that the movement of the way is getting bigger and going out further than Jerusalem, decides that he's going to hit the road and hunt down other followers in Damascus. So in Acts 9:2, he asks the high priest for letters of reference to the leaders of the synagogues. And he says, if found any who belong to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. But something happens to Saul, right? As he approached Damascus, after what would have been nearly 2 weeks on the road, he's overcome by a bright light. He's knocked off his horse, struck blind, and hears the voice of Jesus saying, why do you persecute me? So what happened? How do we understand this story of conversion, its relationship to the overall story of Acts, and the persecution and growth of the early movement of the followers of the way, and its relevance for our own movement today? I think the traditional understanding, or at least the way that I remember learning about this story, is and how it's often reinforced in our culture is similar to how a child might ask, why do we have to drive? Why can't we just be there? Or in the movie The Matrix, when instead of learning Kung Fu, Keanu Reeves just has it uploaded to his brain. It is this fantasy and desire, which is never borne out in reality, of profound change coming effortlessly all at once in a flash of lightning. But those who are leaders in this movement, many of the folks assembled here, who organize, know that this is not how change happens. It may take a lifetime or many lifetimes. The Apache and other indigenous groups talk about how we should think about our behavior in terms of its impact 7 generations beyond us. With Saul, soon to become Paul, I like to imagine his change had been developing for some time, years maybe. The movement had been slowly working on him and around him, organizing him. Whether he knows it or not, maybe the reaction to more violence that he had in witnessing Stephen's courageous martyrdom was actually an expression of his own fear, his growing uncertainty, a clawing back at the ground starting to fall out from under him. But instead of letting go, he held on tighter and doubled down and tried to force something back together that was falling apart or maybe opening up. And on the journey to Damascus, where he was likely accompanied by those poorer than him, those who helped carry his bags and prepare his food, maybe it started to come together for Saul. What was he doing out here, hustling off to Damascus to hunt down followers of the way? The time on the road gave him time to reflect and put it all together. What he witnessed in Stephen, the actions and devotion of the apostles, the strength and growth of the following, and ultimately, maybe he made the connection back to the person and life of Jesus, and specifically to the crucifixion. Maybe he realized that the movement he was trying to suppress only grew stronger out of that death. And this is both miraculous and terrifying. Who were these followers of the way? Were they mad zealots who threatened the righteous practice of Judaism? Or maybe they had some good ideas but just needed to be reined in. After all, we don't want to risk the few good things we do have. Or were these followers of the way actually just demonic? Do they need to be violently disposed with, exported, reprogrammed, or killed? And is this what Rome wants for them? Is this what the Sadducees and the Pharisees would want? What about the Christian nationalists? Would they line up with these followers of the way? What about the narcissist billionaires or techno-feudalists or Christian progressive or nonprofit leaders? How would they respond to these followers of the way? And maybe Saul saw Damascus in the distance, in his weariness and in his fear and desperation, and then it hit him, and he could start to see and unsee his old ways. Did he, Saul, have more in common with the poor who led the movement of the way? Was he in service of God or of empire? Was his calling to unite people and spread a message of love, rooted in compassion, breaking bread and fellowship and resistance to empire? And then he fell off his horse. So what happened to Paul was not a miracle in the sense of a random coincidence that works out for the best, but it was the miracle of organizing. of belief in and love of our people. The story of Paul's conversion helps us think about how we are going to bring our people to a different way of seeing the world and even commit to taking leadership and bringing that world about. A different way, one that is reminiscent of that early movement, beyond a narrow supremacist nationalist religion and beyond a liberal religion that can't connect and organize and truly be led by the poor and marginalized. Let us remember, how did it happen that we came to be organized into this work? For most of us, it is a many step process, not just A to B, but A to Z. It happens in the classroom with study and reading on Zoom calls and in planning meetings and making art and praying together and singing together. It happens in the streets with action. It happens in conversations with people when you're getting them a meal, or what you learn when you help them fill out Medicaid forms, or give a ride to work, or pick up someone's kids from school. It happens in successes and in failures, to young, to old, conservative, liberal, educated, uneducated, believers and non-believers. It happens over and over and goes nowhere. And then it happens and jumps ahead miles in one day. I bet this is what was happening to Saul for years all around him. And those few disciples that meet him and helped him in Damascus, who saw this Pharisee who had persecuted their people, they too were developing as leaders and being developed by others. And they were organizing others around them. In that moment, they helped Saul become Paul. They helped this Pharisee who persecuted their people see again and see anew, to understand that the life of the movement was a resurrected life, and that the people of the movement were a resurrection people. And he made a decision to finally let go who he really was and to walk with God and realize the world God promises, one of abundance and love and justice. So may we too continue to find our way in this world. May we continue to be open to the leadership and guidance of others and to the guidance of God. May we continue to know the way that gives life abundant and reject the way of domination that denies the freedom and liberation of God. And in the face of power, when it may grow strong and hurt and even kill our people, may we continue to be resurrection people.